The room laughed at her dress before anyone understood it was the most valuable thing in the building. Amelia Hart stepped into the Heritage in Motion Gala at the Whitcomb Gallery in Manhattan just after 8 o'clock, the ivory silk of her old dress catching the cold white lights with a softness that looked almost out of place among the mirrors, chrome sculptures, diamond earrings, and gowns fresh from Paris showrooms. Around her, fashion editors leaned over champagne flutes, photographers waited near the marble staircase, and donors spoke in low voices about legacy while wearing things designed to be noticed from across the room. Amelia had not come to be noticed. She had come because the invitation arrived addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Nathan Cross, and because some part of her still believed dignity meant keeping promises even after love stopped feeling like a safe place to stand. Her dress was simple, long-sleeved, and quietly shaped, with hand-stitched cuffs so delicate they seemed almost drawn onto the fabric. It had no crystals, no dramatic train, no label visible at the back of the neck. To most of the room, that made it forgettable. To Amelia, every thread carried a voice. She had pressed the dress herself that afternoon in her small dressing room, smoothing the sleeves with both palms, careful not to disturb the embroidery her mother had finished by a Chicago window more than 20 years ago. She was reaching for a glass of water when the entrance behind her brightened with camera flashes. Nathan Cross arrived with Scarlett Monroe beside him, and the room responded the way expensive rooms often did when confidence entered before conscience. Nathan wore a black tuxedo cut so perfectly it seemed built to forgive him. Scarlett wore a red gown from a designer's newest collection, all sharp lines and glossy fabric, the kind of dress that announced price before personality. Her hand rested lightly on Nathan's arm, not affectionate enough to be private, not distant enough to be denied. Amelia felt the familiar tightening beneath her ribs, but she did not turn away. Nathan saw her first. His expression changed only slightly, the controlled pause of a man who had expected her to disappear more completely. Scarlett followed his gaze, looked Amelia up and down, and smiled as if she had just been handed entertainment. She leaned close to a nearby guest, but her voice was clear enough to travel. That dress looks older than her marriage. A small laugh broke from someone who regretted it immediately. Another guest looked into her glass. The cameras did not flash, but Amelia felt watched anyway. Nathan did not laugh. That was what made it worse. He only adjusted his cuff link and looked toward the sponsor wall, letting Scarlett's words remain in the air like perfume sprayed too heavily. Amelia stood beneath the gallery lights, her cheeks warm, her throat still, her fingers resting against the embroidered cuff. For one brief second, she remembered her mother's hands guiding the needle through silk, patient, tired, beautiful. Then Scarlett stepped closer, her red dress brushing the polished floor. "I suppose vintage can be charming," she said, tilting her head, "when it is intentional." Nathan finally spoke, but not to defend his wife. "Scarlett," he said softly, with the mild tone one uses for a joke that has gone just far enough to be useful. Amelia looked at him then and understood something with painful clarity. He was not embarrassed by what Scarlett had said. He was embarrassed that Amelia had made the insult possible by showing up as herself. Around them, the gala continued pretending to be elegant. Crystal glasses chimed. A violin quartet played near the far wall. A photographer lifted his camera, hesitated, and lowered it again. Amelia did not explain the dress. She did not tell Scarlett whose hands had made it. She did not remind Nathan that he once called it beautiful when they had nothing but a rented apartment, 2 thrift store lamps, and hope measured in coffee cups. She only smoothed the cuff once, gently, as if calming a living thing, and said, "Not everything valuable was made yesterday." Scarlett smiled wider, believing she had won because Amelia had not raised her voice. Nathan looked away again. But across the gallery, near a wall of archival couture sketches, Vivian Adler had stopped mid-conversation. The legendary designer was staring at Amelia's sleeve with the kind of stillness that made the room around her disappear. Long before the Whitcomb Gallery learned to value the dress, it had hung from a chipped wooden door in a small Chicago apartment where winter pressed against the windows and the radiator clicked like an old clock trying to stay awake. Amelia was 11 the first time she saw her mother lay the ivory silk across the kitchen table. Clara Hart had washed her hands twice before touching it, not because the fabric was expensive, though it was beautiful, but because she believed anything made with patience deserved clean hands and a quiet room. Their apartment sat above a bakery on the west side, where the morning air smelled of yeast, sugar, and bus exhaust, and the sewing machine shared space with schoolbooks, grocery coupons, and a jar of spare buttons sorted by color. Clara worked for people whose names appeared in magazines, but her own name never did. She repaired hems for young designers, finished seams they were too rushed to finish, corrected patterns that arrived with impossible measurements, and embroidered details that later walked down runways beneath someone else's applause. Amelia used to sit beside the window with her homework open, watching her mother guide thread through silk with the kind of concentration other people reserved for prayer. "Real elegance is patient," Clara would say, never looking up. "It does not need to sparkle if the hand behind it was honest." The ivory dress began as a private piece, something Clara worked on after paid orders were finished and the city outside had gone dark. The sleeves took weeks. The cuffs held tiny hand-stitched vines, nearly invisible unless the light touched them from the side. Along the waist, Clara shaped the fabric with folds so soft they seemed to breathe. She never called it a masterpiece. She called it practice, then memory, then finally, one late spring evening, Amelia's. By then Clara had grown thinner, though she still smiled when Amelia noticed too much. She taught her daughter how to press silk without bruising it, how to store a dress with lavender, how to mend a loosened thread instead of hiding it. "Some things survive because someone refuses to throw them away," she said. Years later, after Clara was gone, the dress became the one object Amelia could not pack without sitting down first. She carried it from Chicago to New York in a garment bag across the back seat of a borrowed car, then into the first apartment she shared with Nathan, back when he still made her coffee too strong and called her mother's stitching beautiful because he had not yet learned to measure beauty by what it could do for his image. In those early years, Amelia wore the dress only once, to a small anniversary dinner in Brooklyn. Nathan had reached across the table and touched the cuff with 2 fingers, saying it looked like something from another lifetime. She had thought he meant timeless. She understood later that he meant old. Success changed the vocabulary around her. Simple became plain. Sentimental became impractical. Quiet became forgettable. The dress stayed in the back of her closet while Nathan's world filled with stylists, private fittings, glossy invitations, and women like Scarlett, who wore newness like proof. But Amelia never stopped protecting the ivory silk. She aired it every spring. She repaired one loose thread after a move. She kept the lavender fresh, not because she was trapped in the past, but because her mother's hands were still there in every line. Now, under the cold lights of the Whitcomb Gallery, with Scarlett's laughter still fading and Nathan's silence still sharper than any insult, Amelia touched the cuff again. Across the room, Vivian Adler took one slow step forward, her eyes fixed on the embroidery Clara Hart had sewn beside a Chicago window when no one important was watching. Scarlett did not notice Vivian Adler crossing the gallery. She was too busy watching Amelia the way some people watched a stain on white marble, with fascination wrapped in disgust. The insult had given her an audience, and Scarlett knew how to feed an audience without ever sounding careless enough to be blamed. She lifted her champagne glass, tilted her red gown into the light, and let the fabric catch every flash from the photographers near. "The staircase. I have always admired commitment," she said to the circle around her, her smile bright and sharp. "It takes confidence to wear something that looks like it survived 3 storage units and a church donation bin." A few guests laughed too softly, the kind of laugh people used when cruelty came from someone standing beside money. Amelia felt the heat rise again along her throat, but her face remained still. Her hand stayed near the cuff, thumb resting lightly over one embroidered vine. Nathan stood between the 2 women, elegant and silent, his black tuxedo perfectly tailored, his expression carefully neutral. That neutrality was his favorite hiding place. He could later say he had not mocked Amelia. He could say he had simply avoided conflict. He could say Scarlett had been joking and Amelia had been too sensitive, too sentimental, too attached to things that no longer fit the life they were supposed to be living. Amelia knew all his exits before he took them. Scarlett turned toward Nathan with a practiced softness. "You should have told me vintage was the theme," she said. "I would have brought gloves and a history textbook." Nathan gave the smallest breath of amusement, not enough to be heard by everyone, but enough for Amelia to see. That tiny betrayal landed deeper than the words. Once, Nathan had stood in their first Brooklyn apartment while Amelia wore this same dress and told her she looked like a painting he could not afford. Now he looked at the sponsor wall as though the woman in front of him were bad lighting in an otherwise perfect photograph. A fashion editor nearby glanced from Amelia's dress to Scarlett's red gown, measuring both women with professional cruelty. "The new Valcourt piece is stunning," she said to Scarlett, eager to move towards safer admiration. Scarlett brightened. "Nathan arranged it," she said, letting his name rest between them like jewelry. "Fresh from Paris, fitted this morning. Some men understand that a woman should not have to live in the past." Amelia looked at Nathan then, and for a moment the room seemed to pull back. The music, the glass, the white lights, the painted lips of strangers, all of it receded. Around the simple fact that he had bought another woman a new dress for a public evening while allowing his wife to be shamed for wearing her mother's last piece of work. He must have felt the weight of her gaze, because he finally leaned closer and spoke in a low voice meant only for her. "Do not make this uncomfortable, Amelia." She almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he had confused the wound with the person bleeding from it. "I did not bring discomfort into this room," she said quietly. Scarlett heard enough to smile again. "No, but you did bring that dress." This time Amelia's eyes did shine, only for a second, beneath the gallery lights. She blinked once and held herself upright. Her mother had taught her that fabric remembered pressure. Silk could crease, but it could also be steamed back into grace. Before Scarlett could add another joke, a new silence moved through the group. Not the awkward silence of people avoiding shame, but the alert silence of people sensing authority. Vivian Adler had arrived beside them. She did not look at Scarlett's red gown. She did not look at Nathan's watch or the cameras or the sponsor wall. Her eyes were fixed on Amelia's sleeve, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "May I see the cuff?" Amelia lifted her wrist slowly, and as Vivian Adler leaned closer to the cuff, the gallery around them seemed to fade into the soft mechanical hum of another room, one with old sewing machines, folding tables, and women learning to make broken things useful again. After Nathan's world began filling with private fittings, sponsored dinners, and photographs where Amelia was cropped out by absence rather than scissors, she stopped trying to belong to rooms that only valued her when she made him look stable. At first, the quiet nearly swallowed her. Their apartment on the Upper West Side had closets full of garments chosen by stylists and silence arranged as neatly as furniture. Nathan came home later, spoke less, and corrected more. He said her clothes looked too modest for the circles they moved in. He said she did not understand presentation. He said sentiment was a luxury for people who had not learned how power worked. Amelia listened until his words no longer sounded like truth, only weather passing over a house that had already learned to keep its foundation. The first class began in the basement of a community center in Queens on a Thursday evening in March. The room smelled of instant coffee, warm dust, and donated wool coats. There were 6 women, 3 sewing machines that worked if treated gently, and a cardboard box of clothes people had given up on. A blazer with a torn lining. A dress with a broken zipper. A child's winter coat missing 2 buttons. Amelia did not introduce the class as fashion. She called it repair. She showed them how to thread a needle, how to measure twice, how to turn a hem without rushing, how to make a garment fit a body instead of making a body apologize to a garment. Some of the women came because they needed work clothes for interviews. Some came because they could not afford alterations. Some came because they had spent years being told they were too much, too tired, too old, too late, and they wanted one evening a week where their hands could prove otherwise. Amelia understood them without asking for explanations. She knew what it meant to stand in front of a mirror and hear someone else's judgment louder than her own breath. Week by week, the room changed. The broken zipper became a black interview dress. The torn blazer became a woman's first day at a law office. The child's coat went home with blue buttons shaped like stars. Amelia brought Clara's old tin of needles, the one with the scratched lid, and taught the women the same lesson her mother had given her. Nothing loses value simply because someone careless failed to see it. She never used Nathan's name in that room. She never used Scarlett's. She did not need villains to teach dignity. The cloth was enough. The women were enough. The small victories were enough. Sometimes, after class ended, and everyone left with repaired sleeves folded over their arms. Amelia would sit alone under the buzzing fluorescent light and run her thumb over the ivory cuff of her mother's dress hanging in its garment bag beside her. She understood then that clothing could hold more than beauty. It could hold survival, memory, and the quiet courage of choosing not to be discarded. Back at the Whitcomb Gallery, Vivian's fingertips hovered near the embroidery without touching it yet, respectful in a way Scarlett had not known how to be. Nathan watched with uncertain eyes. Scarlett's smile tightened. Amelia stood still, no longer just a woman being judged for an old dress, but a daughter, a teacher, and a witness to every hand that had ever turned torn fabric back into something worthy of being worn. Vivian Adler did not ask the way other people asked at fashion events, with hunger, curiosity, or the casual entitlement of people who believed access was another form of applause. She asked as if she were standing before something fragile enough to deserve permission. Amelia lifted her wrist a little higher, and Vivian bent closer beneath the gallery lights. The designer was 62, silver-haired, immaculate in black satin, with the stillness of a woman whose name could quiet a room without touching a microphone. For decades, Vivian Adler had been called a visionary, a sculptor of restraint, the woman who made simplicity feel expensive and grief look elegant. Her first collection had become fashion history because of its impossible handwork, the delicate vine stitching, the softened waist folds, the cuffs that seemed almost alive when the model moved. Critics had called it instinct. Magazines had called it genius. Vivian had called it survival, though she had never explained why. Now, as she studied Amelia's sleeve, the years came back to her with the force of a scent remembered too late. Chicago, 1996. A borrowed studio with leaking windows. For unpaid assistants. 10 unfinished garments. One deadline that could have ended everything before it began. Vivian had been young then, talented but exhausted, staring at silk she could not afford to ruin and patterns she did not know how to save. A quiet seamstress named Clara Hart had arrived through a friend of a friend, carrying a tin of needles and a lunch wrapped in wax paper. Clara spoke little, but her hands understood fabric the way musicians understood silence. She fixed the waistlines without arrogance. She softened the cuffs. She added vine embroidery so fine the thread looked like breath held inside silk. Vivian remembered standing over her shoulder near dawn, watching that hand move. "You should sign this work," Vivian had told her. Clara had smiled without looking up. Some women sign by making sure the dress stands longer than the moment. The collection launched 6 weeks later. Vivian Adler became famous before she learned how easily the world forgets the hands beneath a name. She had tried to find Clara after success came, but the workroom had closed, the phone number no longer worked, and the industry moved forward the way industries do, stepping over quiet women while celebrating loud results. For years, Vivian carried that guilt like a pin under the lining of a perfect coat. And now, beneath the Whitcomb Gallery lights, Clara's work was inches from her hand. Vivian did not touch the cuff until Amelia gave the smallest nod. Then she rested 2 fingers near the embroidery, gentle as a blessing. "Who made this?" she asked. Amelia's voice caught before it steadied. "My mother, Clara Hart." Vivian closed her eyes for half a second. It was not enough to look emotional to the room, but Amelia saw the recognition move through her face. Nathan shifted beside them, suddenly uncomfortable with a conversation he did not control. Scarlett glanced from Vivian to Amelia, her smile thinning as she realized the old dress had drawn the attention her red gown had failed to hold. "Clara Hart," Vivian repeated, softly, and the name seemed to change the temperature around them. A fashion editor nearby leaned forward. A photographer lifted his camera. A small circle of guests stopped pretending not to listen. Vivian looked at Amelia now, not at the dress alone, but at the woman wearing it. "Your mother saved my first collection," she said. "And this is not vintage. This is a lost piece of American couture." Scarlett's face went still. Nathan's hand dropped from his cuff link. Amelia felt the room tilt, not loudly, not cruelly, but with the quiet force of truth finally finding the correct body to stand in. For several seconds, no one around Amelia seemed to know where to place their eyes. Scarlett's red gown still burned under the gallery lights, expensive and flawless, but attention had slipped away from it as quietly as silk sliding from a chair. Nathan looked from Vivian Adler to Amelia's cuff, searching for an angle, a polite explanation, anything that could return the room to the version of the evening where he understood his own importance. But Vivian was still looking at the embroidery with the reverence of someone standing before a door she had once lost and never expected to find again. Amelia felt the weight of that attention, not as vanity, but as something more difficult to bear. Proof. Proof that her mother had not imagined her own talent. Proof that the hands Nathan dismissed as sentimental had once helped shape the language of an entire fashion house. Scarlett recovered first, because people who mistake cruelty for confidence often mistake silence for weakness. She gave a light laugh, though this one did not land as easily as the others. "Well," she said, lifting her glass toward the small circle of guests, "old fabric can still be useful as a history lesson, I suppose." No one laughed. The fashion editor who had praised Scarlett's gown a minute earlier lowered her eyes to Amelia's sleeve. A photographer shifted his camera toward Vivian, waiting. Nathan stepped closer to Amelia, his voice low enough to sound private, but sharp enough to remind her of every polished correction he had ever made in public. "Do not be dramatic," he said. Scarlett was only joking. Amelia turned to him slowly. For a moment, she saw the whole marriage in that sentence. The insult made harmless, the wound made unreasonable, the woman asked to absorb embarrassment so the man could stay comfortable. Behind Nathan, Scarlett's smile returned in a thinner form, as if she still believed beauty could outrank history if it stood close enough to power. Amelia did not raise her voice. She did not explain that her mother had worked until her fingers stiffened in cold Chicago winters. She did not tell Nathan that Vivian Adler's recognition had reached a place in her heart his approval had abandoned years ago. She only brushed one fingertip over the cuff, where Clara's tiny vines curved toward the sleeve like something alive refusing to be buried. "Some jokes age worse than old silk," she said. The words were soft, but the room heard them. Nathan's face tightened. Scarlett looked away first. Vivian's gaze moved from Amelia to Nathan, and the kindness in it cooled into something clean and formal. "No," Vivian said, her voice quiet but unmistakable. "This is not a joke. This is authorship." The words seemed to settle on the marble floor between them. Authorship, not nostalgia, not charity store vintage, not an old dress carried into the wrong room by a woman who did not know better. Authorship. A staff member approached Vivian then, reminding her that her remarks were scheduled before the archival presentation. Vivian did not look away from Amelia. "Then the remarks have changed," she said. The staff member hesitated, then nodded and moved toward the stage. Scarlett's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it, perhaps realizing there was no sentence left that would make him look generous. Across the gallery, the lights near the platform dimmed one shade lower, and the conversations began to soften as guests turned toward the stage. Vivian gently released Amelia's wrist, but not before giving the cuff one final look, as if promising Clara Hart that this time, the name would not disappear. "Stay where I can see you," Vivian said to Amelia. Then she walked toward the microphone, carrying the silence of the room with her. Vivian Adler stepped onto the platform, and the Whitcomb Gallery changed its posture around her. The small stage had been built between two walls of archival sketches, beneath white lights that made every seam, jewel, and expression appear more honest than people intended. Behind her, a projection screen waited with the official Heritage in Motion logo, clean, expensive, and meaningless compared with the silence she carried to the microphone. Guests gathered closer, champagne glasses lowered, conversations folding into themselves as editors, donors, photographers, and designers turned toward the woman whose name had shaped half the room's careers. Scarlett stood beside Nathan with her chin lifted, still holding her red gown in the light, as if visibility could protect her. Nathan remained near Amelia, his shoulders squared, his expression composed with effort, but his eyes kept returning to the cuff as though the thread itself had accused him. Amelia stayed where Vivian had asked her to stay. She did not move forward. She did not hide. The ivory silk fell quietly around her, old to anyone who worshipped novelty, alive to anyone who understood hands. Vivian looked at the prepared note card on the podium, then placed it face down without reading a word. "I was asked tonight to speak about heritage," she began. Her voice was calm, low, and certain enough to make even the photographers wait before lifting their cameras. Most people in fashion believe heritage is what survives in archives, behind glass, under perfect temperature, cataloged by people with degrees and gloves. But that is only one kind of survival. A soft murmur moved through the room. Vivian looked past the first row of donors, past the sponsor wall, past Scarlett's red dress, and found Amelia beneath the gallery lights. Another kind survives in private closets, in garment bags carried across state lines, in mothers teaching daughters how to press silk without bruising it, in women whose names never appeared on invitations, though their work held entire collections together. Amelia felt her breath catch. Nathan shifted beside her. Scarlett's smile vanished, then returned in a careful, smaller shape. Vivian continued. When I was young, before this industry knew my name, there was a seamstress in Chicago who helped me finish my first collection. I have spent decades being praised for a kind of restraint I did not invent alone. Tonight, I saw that restraint again, not in a new gown, not in a sponsored piece, but in a dress someone in this room mistook for something outdated. The room went still enough for Amelia to hear the faint buzz of the gallery lights above them. A fashion editor slowly turned from Scarlett to Amelia. A donor near the front whispered, then stopped. Vivian lifted one hand toward Amelia, not dramatically, just enough to guide the room's attention without forcing it. There is a dress here tonight that carries a name this industry forgot. Scarlett's lips parted. Nathan's face lost another layer of certainty. Amelia stood with one hand resting near the hand-stitched cuff, feeling the invisible presence of Clara Hart beside her, not as a ghost, but as pressure in the fabric, patience in the thread, love made visible at last. Vivian's eyes softened, but her voice did not break. And before this evening continues, I will not allow that name to be overlooked again. Vivian turned slightly toward the projection screen, and the official gala logo disappeared behind her. In its place came a black and white photograph of a narrow Chicago workroom from the late 1990s, its walls crowded with paper patterns, muslin drafts, and bolts of pale fabric stacked beneath a window. The image was not glamorous. It held no runway, no champagne, no famous faces smiling toward cameras. It held a sewing table, a chair, a tin of needles, and a woman standing half-turned from the lens, her dark hair pinned low, her hands resting on a piece of ivory silk. Amelia stopped breathing for one small second. She knew that tilt of the head. She knew those shoulders. She knew the way her mother stood when she was concentrating, as if the world had gone quiet around the thread. Clara Hart, Vivian said, and the name crossed the gallery like a door opening after years of being locked. Amelia lifted one hand to her mouth, but only for a moment. Then she lowered it, because her mother had not taught her to collapse under recognition. She had taught her to stand straighter when beauty finally told the truth. The next image appeared, a yellowed sketch with cuff details drawn in pencil, then a close photograph of vine embroidery from Vivian's first collection, then Amelia's sleeve magnified beside it. The match was unmistakable. Guests leaned forward. Cameras rose slowly. The fashion editor who had praised Scarlett's red gown stared at the screen with a different face now, not hungry, not dismissive, but almost humbled. Vivian looked toward Amelia. Ms. Hart, she said, her voice formal with respect. Would you join me? The room turned. Scarlett did not move. Her red gown still looked expensive, still perfect, still new, but it no longer looked important. Nathan stood beside her, his expression emptied of the certainty he had worn all night. Amelia took one step, then another, the ivory dress moving softly around her ankles. No one laughed now. No one whispered about age, closets, or charity bins. The silence had changed its allegiance. When Amelia reached the platform, Vivian did not touch the dress like an owner claiming an object. She stood beside Amelia like a witness honoring another woman's work. This garment, Vivian said, gesturing gently toward the sleeve, is not a relic. It is not a costume. It is one of the last known pieces made by Clara Hart, the seamstress whose handwork shaped the visual language of my first collection. I have searched for proof of her authorship for more than 20 years. A sound moved through the gallery, soft and stunned. Nathan's face tightened as if he had finally heard the insult he allowed spoken back to him in another language. Evidence. Scarlett looked toward him, but he offered nothing. There was nothing left to offer. Vivian continued. Look at the restraint in the sleeve. Look at the waist. Look at the patience of the stitch. This is not old fabric trying to survive a modern room. This is a masterpiece of restraint, grief, and grace. The last word seemed to settle directly over Amelia's heart. She looked down at the cuff, and for the first time that evening, the tears in her eyes did not come from humiliation. They came from return. Her mother's name was no longer folded in a garment bag, no longer hidden in a small apartment, no longer carried only by a daughter who remembered. It was standing under white gallery lights while the people who had laughed at the dress stood very still. Vivian reached for a bouquet of white flowers from the side of the stage and placed it in Amelia's hands. "The industry owes Clara heart gratitude," she said. "And tonight, we begin by saying her name correctly." Applause began near the back, hesitant at first, then fuller, spreading across the room until the marble seemed to hold the sound. Amelia looked out and saw Nathan below the platform, pale beneath his perfect tuxedo, while Scarlett's bright confidence dimmed beside him. Amelia did not look away because she was afraid. She looked away because the moment no longer belonged to them. The applause carried Amelia for a moment, but it did not carry her away from herself. She stood beside Vivian Adler beneath the clean white lights of the Whitcomb Gallery, holding the bouquet against the ivory silk her mother had touched a lifetime ago. And for the first time that night, the dress no longer felt like something she had to protect from the room. The room had finally learned how to approach it. Vivian stepped slightly back, giving Amelia the microphone with the same care she had shown the cuff, and the gesture made the gallery grow quiet again. Amelia looked at the black and white photographs still glowing behind her. Clara Hart in the Chicago workroom, half turned from the camera, hands resting on silk, unaware that one day her daughter would stand in Manhattan while strangers finally spoke her name with respect. Amelia felt the ache rise, but it was not the old ache of being mocked, dismissed, or made small beside another woman's red dress. This was grief finding light. She looked down at the cuff and smiled softly. "My mother never designed to be remembered," she said, her voice steady enough to surprise even herself. "She designed so women could stand straighter." A deeper silence moved through the gallery, the kind that did not come from discomfort, but from people realizing they were being allowed to witness something honest. She believed a dress should not make a woman disappear behind it. She believed it should help her return to herself. Amelia paused, and somewhere near the front, a woman pressed a napkin gently beneath one eye. Vivian lowered her head. Scarlett stood below the platform with her glass forgotten in her hand, her expression emptied of the bright cruelty she had worn so easily minutes before. Nathan remained beside her, his perfect tuxedo suddenly unable to protect him from the simple fact that he had failed to recognize what everyone else was now honoring. Amelia saw him, but only briefly. She did not need his regret to complete the moment. She had spent too many years letting his approval stand between her and her own reflection. "Tonight is not about an old dress," she continued. "It is about every quiet hand that made beauty possible while someone else received the spotlight. It is about mothers, seamstresses, teachers, and women who repaired what others threw away. It is about the work that survives even when the name is forgotten." The applause came slowly this time, not as spectacle, but as recognition. Vivian reached for Amelia's hand and raised it just enough for the light to catch the embroidered cuff. Cameras flashed now, but Amelia no longer felt exposed by them. She felt witnessed. Nathan took one step toward the platform, then stopped. There was no graceful way to enter a story after choosing to stand outside its truth. Scarlett turned slightly away from him, her red gown bright, but strangely weightless beneath the gallery lights. Amelia did not watch them unravel. She looked instead at the women near the back, the assistants, interns, seamstresses, stylists, and young designers who were clapping with their whole faces, as if Clara Hart's name had opened a door for more than one person. When Amelia stepped down from the platform, Vivian walked beside her, not ahead of her. The crowd parted with a respect Amelia had not asked for, but no longer feared receiving. Her ivory dress moved softly around her like a memory made visible, not new, not loud, not expensive in the way Scarlett understood, but priceless in the only way that mattered. That night, Amelia did not need a new dress. She wore her mother's name like a crown, and left the room with every eye finally trained to see what love, patience, and dignity had made.